This is my custom built Windows PC. It's powered by the AMD Ryzen 5 3600, 16GB of RAM, a 1TB NVMe SSD, and the NVIDIA 2070 Super. At the moment, it's really only used for occasional gaming and video editing, simply because it's the most powerful computer I own. This, on the other hand, is my 2019 13-inch MacBook Pro. It has an Intel i5 processor, 8GB of RAM, a 128GB SSD, and integrated Intel graphics. The only reason I own this thing is for cross-platform development. That's also the only reason I own an iPhone, which most of the time is sitting on a desk full of dust. Now, these are both incredible tools, but when it comes to programming, I much rather use this. This is my 2015 XPS 13. It rocks an Intel i7 processor, 16GB of RAM, a 512GB NVMe SSD, and integrated Intel graphics. So having multiple options, why do I prefer to use a much older machine? Well, because it runs Arch Linux. So in this video, I want to talk about why I prefer to use Linux as a programmer compared to using macOS or even Windows. And the first reason why is because you can learn so much about computers using Linux. I've been using Linux for over 6 years now, and throughout that time, I have learned so much about computers. My introduction to Linux was actually with an operating system called Elementary OS. Now, I chose Elementary OS simply because it looked cool at the time, so that's really why I chose it. As a way for me to really learn Linux, I decided to actually wipe my entire system, which at the time I was running Windows 7, and install Elementary OS. This way I was forced to actually learn how to use it. And at the beginning, I actually broke the system within the first 30 minutes just by trying to configure LightDM, which is a display manager on Linux. Now, this has been the journey of doing that. So I've often broke my system, fixed it, broke it, fixed it, broke it, fixed it. And with the experience I've gained by breaking things and fixing things, I can now use it in my real work. So for example, I can deploy servers, and if anything goes wrong, I generally know where to look for things and how to fix them because of the experience I've had just messing with computers and with the help of Linux. Now, the second reason why I like using Linux as a programmer is because Linux teaches you to be super flexible. I grew up using Windows, so naturally, when I did the switch from my Windows operating system to Linux, I quickly learned that there's a lot of things that just don't work on Linux. A lot of applications that you might be used to using on Windows that just won't work on your Linux machine. So because of this, if you want to get any work done, often you have to look for other software. Now, for some of you, this might seem like a total nightmare, right? Going through your applications list on Windows and then finding alternatives that will actually run on Linux. However, as a developer, this has really helped me grow a lot. You see, when you're not reliant on specific tools, this teaches you that you can actually pivot and adapt to different systems and environments really quickly. And you will find that as you excel with your career as a software developer, having the ability to pivot and find alternatives can be super powerful. This is a great segue into reason number 3, and that's all of the things that you can learn from open source software. When you don't have the tools you need, it doesn't take very long to discover the world of open source software. Now, open source software is not by any means specific to Linux. You can use it on macOS or even on Windows. However, most of the public software available for Linux is actually open source software. And as a Linux user, this means that you get to learn a lot about it. And this was actually my introduction to sites like GitHub, which hosts millions upon millions of open source software. And if you're watching this video, chances are that you already know about GitHub. But do you know how to install software from source? I sure didn't before I started using Linux. You see, if you're like me and you've been using Windows for a long time, your program installation procedure probably looks something like this. First, you download the exe file from some website. Then you go to your downloads folder or wherever you downloaded that file to and double click it. And then usually you'll keep pressing next and even ignore the terms and conditions page, keep pressing next, and then finally you'll finalize the installation of the program. Because you've grown accustomed to this, when it comes to installing software differently, like from source, you probably have no idea how to do that. However, as a developer, it's important that you know how to do this at least once in your life, because before you can actually distribute your program in that fancy exe file, you first have to know how to actually build it. In addition, once you know how to actually build software from source, which you'll find yourself doing pretty often on Linux for certain applications, you now have the ability to increase the number of applications that you have access to. And building software from source is just one of those things that you can learn how to do from being exposed to open source software. However, open source software has a bunch of possibilities, and even just being able to read some of the code for these programs will help you develop and grow as a software developer. I know in my experience, it really has helped. Now, there is one more reason why I prefer to use Linux as a software developer. And if I had to categorize these reasons, this will definitely be up there. It would be the first reason and the reason why I've stuck with it for over 6 years. And that reason is the Linux terminal. If you have used Linux before, you know that a lot of the Linux ecosystem revolves around this concept of a terminal. And sure, more user-friendly Linux distributions like Ubuntu, Linux Mint, and even Elementary OS will actually limit your exposure to the terminal by giving you easy-to-use desktop applications. However, as a software developer, it's really hard to avoid using the command line. And honestly, the command line tends to scare a lot of beginner developers away just because it's maybe not as intuitive and it takes a while to actually learn how to use it. With that said, I can for sure tell you that the Linux command line is by far the best tool I have ever used as a software developer. Once you get the hang of it, you realize how useful it is. In essence, all the command line is a program which gives you access to a bunch of other programs. Now, those other programs can actually make you super efficient as a software developer, and some of them can be super powerful. And once you start seeing these tools in action and actually start using them, you kind of realize that not every single program needs to have a GUI, a user interface, so you can actually interact with it. A lot of times it actually makes a lot of sense for a program not to have that, because instead of like going through your mouse and clicking through a bunch of menus, cascading menus that you have to go through, it makes a lot of sense to use a combination of flags and arguments just to do whatever you want to do very quickly. So that's really one of the coolest things about the terminal. So those are the reasons why I prefer to use Linux as a programmer compared to using any other operating system. If you're a programmer yourself and if you use Linux, let me know in the comments down below why you like it, or even just why you don't like it. That might be cool to hear. If you're new here and you're enjoying the content, consider subscribing. And with that said, I'll see you on the next one. Peace.